my biggest mistake in the initial tries at trying to attract investor interest was an assumption that if I just came in with the killer data set, that I would completely wow over investors in terms of de-risking the technology, and there would be a huge motivation to invest just in the science of the data alone.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Wesley Jackson, the co-founder, president, and the chief scientific officer of Valitor. Wes was the founding CEO and led the startup through its Series B financing, where they raised over $30 million to date. Valitor is a biotech startup that uses a novel protein biopolymer conjugation technology that was licensed from the University of California, Berkeley. Professors Kevin Healy and Dave Schaefer were the inventors of the technology and ended up co-founding the startup. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about Wesley's decision-making process to launch the startup, the conjugation technology and the problems it is capable of solving, customer discovery process, lessons learned from working with partners, finding product market fit, fundraising, importance of work-life balance while building a deep tech startup, a very important topic that is generally frowned upon at startups, and programs that help Wes grow his startup and leadership transition. It was a lot of fun learning about Wes on this podcast. I've known Wes for a while professionally, where he was always available to offer advice, but this is the first time we got deep into discussion about Valitor. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Welcome to the show, Wes. One of the questions I often get from scientists aspiring to be entrepreneurs is about the decision-making process. How somebody like you finish your postdoc and start the company, what is that decision-making process like in your brain? So I think your journey was slightly non-traditional compared to others, some of the guests that came out to my show, where they finish their PhD or postdoc, start the company immediately. Let's start the conversation there. Let's start with your post-PhD journey until you decide to start the company.
Sure. I would like to go even a little before that.
Please.
I had kind of an unusual and really great experience when I was an undergrad, forming an idea of where I was going to go from school into a job, and I had the opportunity to work with a startup company in the medical device field. It was a very small company when I was hired. I think I was the fifth person hired. And a month later, when I showed up, I was the eighth person actually as part of the company. And it was literally in the founder's garage. It was a very gritty startup, but it really gave me exposure to this being at the early stages of a company, the fast-paced environment and everybody wears every hat environment. From not having any previous industry work experience as an engineer, it was really appealing to me. And seeing how everybody had to be pulling in the same direction and the way the leadership was motivating everyone in the team to follow the vision, it was just a very exciting summer. And I actually went back the next summer and the company had tripled in size by the year I was away. So it gave me a slightly different experience of a slightly larger startup company. We were actually in an office building at that point and out of the garage, but it was the same sense of excitement that we had a technology and everyone was eager to see it translate into clinical trials and beyond. I did go to graduate school from there because there were some additional skill sets I wanted to be able to pick up. But as I was going through my postdoc, I started really identifying some technologies that I thought would be fun to be able to move into the clinical translation space as part of a startup company. And as it happened, the environment I was in at the time, I was working at a joint program between the National Institutes of Health and the Walter Reed Hospital. And there weren't a lot of startup opportunities in that area at the time. The licensing offices I was talking to were really geared towards out licensing to major biotech and med device companies. When I came by and asked if I could get an option to the technology, they were asking six figures up front, which was outside the realm of what I could do as a scrappy startup company.
Who was asking for the six-figure licensing fees?
It was actually a technology licensing group that's affiliated with some of the governmental agencies. But one of the challenges we had as well was multiple technology transfer offices that I was trying to navigate and was just inexperienced. It was a very heavy lift for me to try and take on as a first out licensing opportunity. At the same time, as I was trying to get something started on the East Coast, I was actually reading, I remember one of the engineering alumni magazines about the work Doug Crawford and Reg Kelly were doing to build a bioentrepreneur environment in the Bay Area.
Both guests on my show previously.
Yeah. It was really the realization that I'm on the wrong side of the country to be doing what I want to do. So fortunately, my family moved back, and that's what put me in this environment. And reaching back to some of the advisors I had in graduate school, talking with Kevin Healy and Dave Schaefer, they had a technology that I think I had touched a little bit as a graduate student, but had evolved quite a bit. And we thought it was a good time to spin that out and go the commercialization route. And so that was the way I ended up in a position to help get Valitor off the ground.
Great. I think there's so many threads I can go after. You mentioned so many things. So the startup seeds were sown during your undergrad days. If I may ask, what kind of startup was that you were working with during your undergrad?
Yeah, it was a cardiovascular-based stent that was designed to help protect the brain during open heart surgery. It was real fun as at the time, mechanical engineer focused bioengineer to have that opportunity to be building these stents and then seeing them tested in a variety of different ways.
Excellent. I think that exposure is so important, that awareness, as opposed to just doing your undergrad school, and then go grad school. If you're not exposed to things that you could be doing, I think that is a debacle of sorts in the current education system.
Yeah. And as someone who hadn't really ever worked in a company, large or small, the mechanisms of how a company operates seemed overwhelming. And then to be in an environment where there's 8 people and all of the mechanisms of running a company are able to be achieved, it was just an enabling opportunity for me to realize, I think I could do this eventually. Once I had the right technology and the right environment, it suddenly became less esoteric and more concrete in terms of an achievable path.
And then your training during your PhD, what was that around?
So it was, again, mechanically focused, looking at the biomechanics of bone cells and understanding how the changes in their biomechanics were involved in sensing loads and bone remodeling. It was a very interesting project with a very challenging path towards any sort of clinical translation. It was great. I learned a lot. It was a fun project to put together, but when I got ready to go towards a postdoc, I wanted something that had more direct clinical application. We went from very intracellular mechanism type science to tissue engineering, kind of organ system level communication. And that was really where I got interested in the biotech field. So coming out of that postdoc experience is where I was looking for opportunities that were more directed in drug development and ways to combine my training in biomaterials and mechanical engineering, but now employing those to generate better medicines.
Great. The reason I'm asking that question is because I think that early stage of a startup, what people are looking for is that founder technology fit. That's what I was trying to dig up there. And then you met Kevin Healy and Dave Schaefer. Dave was, again, a guest on the show. What is the problem you guys were trying to solve at that point, and the state of the technologies in the past, like that are being used, and how you are different in terms of technology?
The core technology that everything Valitor is built on is what we call multi-valent polymer conjugation. And we take multiple copies of a drug moiety and we conjugate those to very long chain biopolymers. So The often analogy we use is imagine a string of Christmas lights where the biopolymer is the cord and the Christmas lights are the drug, and then loosely wadded up because they form these spherical entities on average. This came out of work that Kevin Healy was doing in his lab, trying to design originally cell-instructive surfaces. And then teaming up with Dave Schaefer, they were looking for ways to bring the coordinated delivery of these multi-valent interactions off the surface and into solution. And one of the primary applications was for using these multivalent conjugates as a way to better maintain or differentiate stem cells into downstream lineages for cell replacement therapies. As I came into the discussions that were being had, there was an initial thought that, well, if we can use these in an in vitro context, how can they be translated into therapeutic contexts? One of the first tasks that I started getting involved with for company formation was identifying therapeutic areas where we'd be able to make a differentiating impact for patients using the technology. It had some obvious comparisons to technologies that were more established, like pegylation. And I think one of the key breakthroughs we had was to recognize pegylation's great. It's used in a number of therapeutic contexts when you want to keep a drug in systemic circulation for longer durations. If you're focused more on tissue localization, it doesn't work as well. That's where we identified a sweet spot and some real orthogonality relative to technologies that were already a little bit more mature. And that gave us a toehold to really start describing what Valitor does and a value proposition that sets us aside from other areas in the space.
So basically, the technology was developed by Kevin Healy and Dave Schaefer, and you were looking at that translation part of it. Before I go into the details, this was your own first startup company. Paint a picture of what you thought this journey was going to be like. How much did you actually think through? How hard or how easy it was going to be? We can go through this thread during this conversation, but keep that as a background if there is any initial points that you want to touch upon and the surprises or the shocks in the journey.
Yeah, it's funny you ask how hard I thought it was going to be, because I'm not sure I gave that much consideration. In retrospect, probably should have. I think the interest I had in the technology and the excitement I had about areas that we could see it applied were maybe blinding me to the realities of the challenges that I had ahead for a decade or more. In retrospect, I had some clear overconfidence in what I would be able to do and how much time it would take. But all of that is also in the context of I had a really good time doing it. It was a lot of hard work early on and just trying to build the story, communicate the story, and scrap together enough funding for us to actually execute on any parts of that story. But all along the way, I was able to learn a lot. I really liked the process of learning how to be an entrepreneur and had a really neat technology that I got to play with along the way.
Yeah. The naivety helps. Otherwise, people might not jump into this journey. But two important factors in there. One, the learning experience in this process. I think startup teach you more than anything else than a 9-to-5 job, I believe, and making it fun. I think that's going to be super important. If you're not having fun, you're lost. On that note, so you have this technology and you're trying to see who's going to use that, the use areas, and what is the customer discovery process like for you? Who did you talk to initially in terms of a market? What was the validation that you received from these people? And was there a hypothesis in your mind that these are going to be my customers? And were there any evolutions in that thoughts based on what feedback you're getting?
We had a 2-part process to thinking about who our customers would be. And initially, I spent a lot of time talking to anybody at UCSF who was willing to take a meeting with me, a lot of the clinicians, really understanding where are the challenges that they're seeing in either compliance or efficacy or safety of existing drugs or drugs that are in development, and trying to understand where is there a gap between what would be their ideal methodology for treating patients and why aren't there therapies that are filling that gap. In doing so, we had a sense of how our technology could bridge that gap. So, a lot of the early years at Valitor was really spent talking to doctors, finding areas where we had a strong suspicion, a good hypothesis for how our technology could be married with therapeutics or mechanisms that could provide that ideal mode of treatment for the clinicians, and then scrapping together enough preliminary data that we could write a grant and then build on that hypothesis with grant funded research. We had investigated several different areas. Part of our product market fit was we sometimes had a great idea based on what we thought our technology could do for clinicians, but then could not get a grant funded. So there was some external feedback in that grant submission process that would help guide us. In other areas where we had great ideas and our hypothesis didn't quite pan out, that we were providing the same benefits to the same degree that we expected. And then in other areas, we were able to really start generating a lot of data demonstrating that we had a pipeline that could deliver improvements in that area. So the grant funding we had was really great to be able to marry the ideas that we were generating with clinicians to the technology and being able to demonstrate proof of concept. And then the other part of the customer identification was the realization that we had a technology that could be married with existing therapeutics at various stages in their IP lifecycle. The separate set of customer identification was reaching out to potential partners to see what are their needs in terms of being able to enhance products already in their portfolio, and how do we marry ourselves to those technologies, and where's the right insertion point for us to start working with partners. So there were two different strategies we had in working with our customers, which in neither case was the end user or the end beneficiary. But I think it did help us think through and prioritize platform opportunities as a result.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's go back to your conversations with physicians and researchers at UCSF. You must have gotten so many signals from a lot of people in different directions. And part of the driving force is whether you can be funded or not. There's a grant process there. And how do you determine noise versus signal? You can end up working on projects after projects after projects like a researcher. I don't know how much you gave a thought about that at that point, because as an early stage founder, if a physician says like, oh, this is a great use, I'm going to work with you, you start working on them. Like, how does an early stage entrepreneur think about that process, about signing onto a project? Hindsight, we have that advantage now.
I think it's oftentimes looking for the alignment between different clinicians that you're talking to. I think one of the fun things about our technology is it could almost be viewed as like a Lego set for drug developers or drug hunters or clinicians to say, let's put these different interchangeable pieces together and we can think of these new great therapeutics. So in meeting with these customer groups, we had the opportunity to get a lot of idea generation as well. And some of those were great ideas that we were able to then get additional feedback from other clinicians or other potential partners to see, is there really signal here? And others would immediately realize that is just noise. So we'll move on to something that's generating a little bit more signal. One of the things I realized a few years into the process is trying to separate the signal from the noise requires more than just looking towards the clinicians for their feedback. It was also necessary to talk to regulatory specialists, our IP attorney, folks that know CMC and a variety of other stages in the drug development process to identify where the technology would be positioning itself for success in, clinical trials towards approval, and where it may sound like a great idea, but there's some hurdle downstream that unless you're asking the right person, you're not going to find out about as being a challenge. That was all part of that prioritization process to see where those signals were actually going to continue to point us in a direction towards a product that has a pathway to approval.
Those are signals. And then coming to noise, in my mind, I think there are two kinds of noises. One is good and one is bad. I don't know where things fall. People say this won't work. You must have gotten a lot of no's from people like, oh, this is crap. It won't work. I tried this. How do you take no's? This is a theme I will continue down the lane in other topics as well. But how do you react and how did you get used to it and the lessons from those no's?
Yeah, I don't think you get used to it. I don't get used to it. It still
hurts.
Yeah, frustrating, hurtful sometimes. I think the bottom line is, as an entrepreneur, like you're mostly going to hear no's. And part of being an entrepreneur is you've got an idea that it may seem completely logical and straightforward with all the information and optimism that you're holding inside yourself. But if everybody had that, everybody would be entrepreneurs. There's a element of having enough confidence that sometimes you can prove someone wrong when they say no. Other times you got to listen to the no and hear what's behind it. There's really good reasons why someone's telling you it's not going to work. We're not going to fund you. This is a crazy idea. I always recommend people don't automatically just assume, well, I'm going to prove you wrong, but let's figure out what that thread is behind the no and incorporate that into the plan. So a no from one person just helps you get to a yes with the next person. It's a lot of learning as you go. And it is ultimately constructive criticism. And it's sometimes hard to remember that when you're hearing it, but take a breath, incorporate that feedback, and move on to the next person.
Were there any memorable no's that you heard that you learned the most from?
In terms of the pipeline prioritization, for example, we had some elements we were really excited about. It wasn't just that we had one no, but when you hear a chorus of no's, all for the same reason, then it's maybe worth thinking either there really is something here I don't understand well enough to know why I'm so far in the minority, or maybe the timing's just not right. That I think was helpful for us to understand where we were getting the most excitement from, for example, the investment community. And there's wisdom in crowds, right? Multiple no's can sometimes be a very strong signal.
Let's go back to something you mentioned about partners. There are existing probably drug-like moieties that you could work with. What are those conversations like in terms of partners? How did you identify partners? And who are these companies or firms that you're talking to gave you the most relevant information in terms of what you could use? Because there's so many levels of people and you just talk to the first person that you get hands on. Sometimes they may not be helpful. The reason I'm asking this question is, how does one identify the right person in the company who can make the decision to work with you?
Partnering in particular is really a timing and persistence game, at least in my experience. Even if you're talking to a scientist or a BD specialist who thinks your technology is the greatest thing they've ever seen, if it's not already aligned with the company strategy, then there's just not alignment and nothing's going to happen. What I've found is it's good to be talking to people at any level, that you can be a bug in the ear of the scientists, the business development folks, the search and evaluation teams. And ultimately, you've got to have the right technology at the right time for them. If you happen to be talking to the right person at the right time, that's great. If you've been a bug in their ear and they have you front of mind when the need for your technology comes around, then you're just increasing the likelihood that you're going to get a call up. That's happened to us at times. Out of the blue, I got a call from a search and evaluation team that's like, I remember we talked to you a while back and we want to have another conversation with you. So any opportunity to talk with partners is valuable. Even if at the moment it feels like, well, great, that was another meeting that went nowhere. You never know when it's going to come back and something you said spur a memory in someone's mind that reinvigorates the conversation.
What are the right questions to ask? Whether it is timing, the alignment, any lessons learned in that process?
I don't know that I have any outstanding gems of wisdom here, but one of the key challenges in those conversations is I don't want to give away everything I'm doing. And certainly they don't want to tell us what their challenges are. So it's a little bit of reading between the lines and trying to get a sense of where technologies are moving, what they're going to be looking for in the future. That's kind of an odd dance.
It is. In an ideal world, I really want these partners to tell us the problems so we can actually solve the right problems. And I've found this in the group mentality. If you have a group of people talking about a problem, nobody's going to fess up about anything because they're in a group. Everything works fine.
One thing that I have found to be useful when I can get these answers, finding out what are the critical data points they're going to need to see in order to move the discussion forward, because that can be instructive on what I want to be able to provide the next time we meet. But it can also give you a little bit of the peek behind the curtain on what's front of mind for them in terms of challenges for technologies in whatever space you're in. It's a little bit of a peek. Maybe it's not the most instructive, but it can at least provide some good guidance.
I think that's a good point. That's a very great point, actually. Trying to get some data points to move the needle to the next meeting. That shows progress and commitment from your side and some insights from their side.
That is true not only for potential partners, but also for investors. Having a one-off meeting makes it very challenging for them to assess how productive you are, how well you're able to overcome challenges. But when you're able to have meetings over time, you're able to highlight challenges you've overcome, major milestones you've reached. And all of that, I think, can be very confidence inspiring in the team and increases their willingness or eagerness to work with you going forward.
And a related question could be, when did you realize there was a product market fit? What was that moment like? And how long did it take for you to realize that? And do you ever reach that stage? Because there seems to be so many moving parts and moving customers. What was that realization for you like?
I definitely remember the moment I realized we had this orthogonal take on developing drugs using biopolymers. And I remember pacing around my kitchen because I had so many ideas and I couldn't write them down fast enough. I think some of those original ideas we are still operating on, and the degree to which we're talking to partners and clinicians to help refine those ideas. But I think there's been some common threads that have spanned years through Valitor. So I think finding the product area first, then understanding what the product requirements were going to need to be, matching those with what we anticipated was possible with our technology, and then iterating from there, I think is where we had more of a refinement on those products rather than it's not aha, this is a new product, let's go. It's more of a let's move in this direction. You kind of see iteration from there.
How long would you say since the founding of the company? Because product market fit is a hard problem. And I think they'll have an appreciation of how long it takes. Any light on that topic?
I think it's an ongoing process. We've had our target product profile for our lead product for years. It has continued to evolve as the market changes, as our understanding of the technology changes, as we know how other products are coming along the pipeline and what clinicians have responded well to or what they haven't responded well to. These are living decisions, I guess, living documents that you have to be visiting very regularly to make sure you're continuing to maintain the same prospective market fit that you thought you had 5 years ago and will have 5 years from now.
That's a great point. Let's switch gears and talk about the funding. When you first started, I don't know, unless you're super rich, you needed money. Talk us to that evolution. Maybe you can break it down into like, if you got some funding from grants, talk about the grants process, and then angels and VCs to your Series B. Start there.
We originally were grant funded. We got funding from the National Institutes of Health through their SBIR program. The decision to start there was because the three of us working together, Dave, Kevin, and I, had comfort writing grants and had some maybe overconfidence in our ability to raise some seed money through grant funding. And we also had kind of a key set of early data points we wanted to be able to generate in order to take forward for other funding mechanisms, either through partnering or through investment. The funding mechanisms are really nice. At the time, we were needing to write phase 1 grants, which had like a $250,000 cap on the funding. So certainly being part of the incubator system was very critical at the time. We would have not been able to do anything with that grant money without the ability to take advantage of core facilities and rent desks at a time. But we ultimately did string together a few grants worth about $2 million that gave us the opportunity to make sure we'd fully translated the technology out of the lab, replicated all the science that was in the original publications and the patents, and in a way that we were starting to really accumulate a lot of know-how within the company. And part of that was expanding on the analytics we were using to characterize the materials we were making. That went a step beyond what was being done in the lab for manuscripts. We needed to have the analytics that would then support the foundation of continuing to develop the technology. And at the same time, we were doing studies on grants that came from multiple institutes looking at different product market fit areas. So seeing where we thought we were going to be able to take that preliminary data and make a case for being able to make the biggest patient impact downstream. In retrospect, we probably waited a little too long to really start heavily fundraising from private investment, dilutive capital from VC. But we were also fortunate that we were continuing to be successful from grant funding. And I think that just gave us a broader platform to be able to talk about our potential to impact multiple clinical areas, as well as a deep understanding of the technology and what we needed to do, not only to make the material at scale, but also be able to characterize it in a way that would be suitable for commercial manufacturing. So all of that pre-seed funding on the grant work really, I think, set us up for a really strong pitch to be able to talk to investors and really convince them that we had enough technology maturity that we were ready to move a product forward.
You mentioned about overconfidence in grant writing. Tell us more. How many attempts did you have to get to the first SBIR?
I think we had our third submission funded, and then was very fortunate we had a second one funded shortly thereafter, and then a third one shortly thereafter. I think there was a little bit of a learning curve in adapting the more academic style grants to the SBIR process, but I think we had a combination of obviously luck, some learning curve to the SBIR, and I think we also just had a story that was really compelling to the reviewers. So I think there was a clear set of challenges that we were able to overcome with the technology, and the reviewers latched onto that.
Tell us about the lessons there. What did you learn from two grants not being funded? Like, what went wrong in your opinion that you made it right in the third one?
We had written grants that either weren't well targeted to the study section in some cases. In other cases, we're putting together a series of studies that would have been great as a manuscript, but not necessarily adding value to the technology and to the company. It took a little bit of trial and error through the review process, but also QB3 was offering some great resources in grant writing for the SBIR program and totally changed the way we were structuring the aims so that everything was focused on what is the value inflection that this grant's going to achieve, and making it clear that we understand what we need to do in order to get the technology to the next stage where we have another shot on goal for private financing. Once we had that shift in the goal of the paper and how to demonstrate how we would leverage the value added through the science we were doing, that we started getting a much more positive reception.
Excellent. I think QB3 workshops are great on the SBIR. Shauna Farrar-Jones, I'm guessing, was the teacher there. I think I need to bring her on as a guest on my show one of these days. There's so many lessons there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's go into that private fundraising path, and what were the lessons learned there, and how were the conversations?
So I think my biggest mistake in the initial tries at trying to attract investor interest was an assumption that if I just came in with the killer data set, that I would completely wow over investors in terms of de-risking the technology, and there would be a huge motivation to invest just in the science of the data alone. It took years for me to realize that's not the right approach. As I was thinking about this earlier today, there were plenty of people along the way who were looking at my decks and recommending, you should really take out a lot of this data. It's making it hard to follow. You're not inspiring anybody with this data. It's not telling a story. And sure enough, eventually I was like, you know what? I just need to take all the data out and it'll be a much better story. Essentially coming to the same conclusion. I could have just followed good advice years earlier. But essentially, in trying to get investors excited, it is about the story, and it's about what you think you can do and why you think you can do it. And the data is important to back up your claims and your plans, but that comes later. The first thing you need to do is generate that spark and that connection with an investor that they see your vision and they also want to see it happen. I, in retrospect, realized we probably could have been fundraising much earlier with the data sets we had if we had focused more on that story and making those connections. Once we learned how to do that, I think the fundraising got not easy, but easier.
If there's one part of your story that really appealed to the investors, what would that be?
The overall platform that we have is, I think, just very engaging. The idea of generating these constructs, it's very easy to start imagining multiple different clinical areas where you could make a big impact. So I think from that kind of foundation, as I describe it in this kind of interchangeable way, many people are able to get pretty excited about what we're doing. And then being able to narrow in on, we have assets in ophthalmology where I think the technology is really unique and really differentiating, giving us shots on goals for multiple huge markets. Seeing that we've focused this broad technology into an area where not only we can make a big impact, but it has many patients that we're able to reach. I think that combination of interesting technology and a really great market fit is what gets people excited.
I think the market is a key thing. And as scientists, right, we were trained to love our technology, and that's where the data part comes from. And the sooner we evolve into that storytelling part of it about the implications and how big that market is, I think if we can paint that picture, that's a big, big lesson. The sooner you learn it, the better it is for you guys. That's a great lesson. Thank you for sharing that. Talking about funding, a big part of it is going to be a team. You were a solo founder of sorts. Kevin and Dave both are faculty at Berkeley, and you are the boots on the ground. Talk us about that evolution of that team, how you became a leader of selling your vision and mission to your potential teammates, and how you're able to recruit the right people.
The team of the three of us was really key in the early days. And I think we are not alone in having our initial team meetings and board meetings of the three of us in a bar on campus. We'd meet on Friday evenings, talk through the challenges, talk through the opportunities, talk science. It was really invigorating to have access to the two of them and have them contributing to the direction of the company. And then ultimately, there just came a time where we needed somebody who was speaking for the company, who was full-time in the company and able to take those reins as we had venture funding coming in behind us. So I think there was kind of an obvious transition as we were bringing in more people and needed that full-time management, which I have really enjoyed being able to have that opportunity to lead the team here at Valitor.
How big is the team right now?
So we have just hired our 12th employee. That is triple our size at the beginning of the year. It's been a fun growth period over the last year for us.
Pretty lean team. I think that goes back to your earlier point of multiple people putting on multiple hats and doing more than what they thought they could.
Yeah, and I do attribute that probably back to that early startup experience that I had of the startup teams, in my view, should be very lean, very cross-functional. And I think we've been really fortunate to hire a team that has a lot of depth of experience in the areas where we need specific help, but then have really, I think, demonstrated a lot of breadth and the capabilities that they're able to reach over and fill other roles as needed just to solve whatever problem we have and keep the overall projects moving forward.
What are the lessons learned from hiring people and getting the right people? Like, what do you do right to get some great people on your team? And if there are any mistakes there while hiring,
make sure you're creating a workplace that people really like working at. I have really had a strong feeling from the start that in biotech, we're not like a software startup where we can spend 3 months in a basement eating burritos, churn out code, and then have a product. We're in a marathon, and we got to recognize that part of that is going to be some pretty heavy sprints. And then other parts of that are going to be times where we need to make sure people are recharging and have a work-life balance and are able to be prepared for the next sprint, because it's probably just around the corner and sooner than you think. That's something I've really tried to make sure that all the employees are able to have, that work-life balance. And another key thing for me, when I was in the early stages of the company, my wife and I had twins, which was a massive lift in terms of going from not being parents to being a parent of two. So it was a little bit of a existential question for me of like, am I going to be able to raise two infants right now and run a company? Obviously was able to do it, but I needed a lot of accommodation in terms of when I was working, how I was working. So I've tried to make sure all my employees who are either have families or are starting families are also able to benefit from those same accommodations so that no one feels like there's a choice between, am I going to be in a startup that's going to be a heavy lift, or am I going to have kids? I think we need to make it possible for both of those to happen.
Wow, you bring up something strange. work-life balance. At startups, people don't talk about it very positively, but it's so important, especially in a deep tech startup like this. It's not like a software company where you got to write code and like sleep at the Twitter office. Elon Musk says, come work here. I don't think it's ever going to be that way, but I'm on Twitter, I hear all these people, you need to work, 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 work. Nobody talks about balance. What kind of investors were you going after? Like, what were the best investors looking like for you? And people who said no, what do you learn from them? And what did good investors look like? What should one look for? I think this is super important because we just go and pitch to everybody we can.
One of the things we've benefited from is very early on, one of our co-leads on our first round was BioVentures, and they are a biotech exclusive investor. I think they were able to help us identify other biotech focused funds to understand that biotech investing is also a marathon. These are long iteration cycles. The clinical trials process is long. FDA is a time consuming agency to work with. They were able to both help us get introductions with other biotech focused investors who would have the same set of expectations and help manage the expectations of groups with less biotech investing. So we've been lucky to have those investors with that biotech investment philosophy already built into their investment philosophies. That can be a challenging cultural difference between biotech investors and investors who are used to investing in products that are not governed by the FDA and are able to have different types of iteration and product cycles.
I'm still stuck on that family balancing because I have two kids now. I'm on the startup journey and like it's so important. I think if you don't have kids, you might not have that appreciation of how much work it is. And you can't give that benefit to your employees if they have kids.
Obviously, the well-being of my employees is front of mind, but also for the company as well, because we have a lot of institutional knowledge in our employees. We are not an industry where it makes sense to burn employees out and hire new ones in. We're not dropping people into pieces of code that they can pick up to speed on the process quickly, and our employees aren't interchangeable. If we aren't conscientious about the needs of the employees, I think that is a detriment to our product development process and to the company in general.
That could be a huge differentiator too. Startups are not the friendliest of the places to raise a family, at least in the Valley. That's how it is. I hope that changes. I really hope that changes because there's no point of burning people out. Maybe that's a good point to talk about your board. You spoke about investors, like what was the board composition like? And when did you start building the board? Probably can list out things like the benefits for you as a founder. What did you learn from them?
I have a board that I've really enjoyed working with, both the board we had at the end of the Series A and during now the Series B. What I hadn't anticipated was the level of constructive feedback that you're able to get during those board meetings and between the board meetings. It's people who are very well informed in the space. They understand companies that are at your stage and the next year, the next 10 years down the road. So it's a really long view of experience from multiple people you're able to bring in around a table all at once. After having worked with a board, I wish we had put together some sort of independent director or some sort of board members that would have provided some very useful feedback context to what we were doing before we had a formal board in place. I'm often recommending to early companies, find somebody who can meet with you and put you through the process of a board meeting, understand the cadence of giving them updates, seeking information and feedback from them. And then when you have a professional board in place, you'll get up to speed using it a lot quicker.
Yeah. How did you recruit the board members?
We have a split of common shareholders and management, as well as investor shareholders that was just determined during the negotiation for the round. The board members were named at that point. The one great thing we have on the board is an independent board member, Gail Medeiros, who has been a biotech company builder her entire career and has just a great view of biotech startups from practically the beginning all the way through IPOs. So it's really great having her be able to provide that very independent view that's separate from management, separate from the common shareholders, but also separate from the investors, and really keyed in on what's best for the company outside of maybe other interests that might creep into the discussion.
I see that you have a new CEO. Walk us through that decision-making process, the evolution from you founding the company with Dave and Kevin, and now transitioning it to a new CEO. And maybe this is a nice place to talk about the culture you've been building and how you're able to propagate that.
It's funny, as I described earlier, this overconfidence that I can do all the things it takes to build a company. And I was in the analogy of the frog in the pot with the water slowly getting turned up in terms of trying to manage the team internally, all the external communications, board management, public relations. And there were just not enough hours in the day. So I think there was a view from the board that we needed to expand the management team. And I think there's a lot of discussion about how do we expand the team? Do we bring in someone who's going to be above me or someone that's going to be part of the C-suite? It was a slow evolving discussion between me and the board of initially suggesting the idea that they might want to bring in another CEO and making sure I wasn't going to storm out the door and quit. And I think as I initially took the stance of, well, we could bring in like a chief business development officer or a chief development officer, someone that can fill in some of the gaps and I'll stay in the CEO seat. But I think part of the discussion became, what could I learn from a professional CEO who's been in that seat of a larger company? And what exactly additional skills do we want to bring in into the management team? Does it make sense to have someone who has that experience of commercialization, of actually bringing the product to the market as the person who's the external facing person of the company, or continue having it be someone who's more scientifically directed? I don't know how any of the discussions evolved within the board, but certainly my view over about a period of a year was, as soon as we close another round and have the funding to attract a professional CEO, it's going to be good for the company, I think, because it'll enable us to take on some characteristics of a larger company that I don't have to do trial and error in order to move the company in that direction. But also it's going to give me the opportunity to learn from somebody who's been in partnering discussions, who's closed deals in sizes and with mechanisms that I've never done before. So in the end, I was looking forward to having that opportunity to have a great mentor as well as another manager in the company.
A common theme in this whole thing is the amount of learning you go through in this process. Nobody teaches you these things, and you just have to figure out everything by yourself. And I'm sure you built a network for yourself. What was that building of that network or support system like for you? Were there programs that helped or anything that other founders should look for if you could start something now? Hindsight.
We've taken advantage of a lot of resources in the community. I should start by saying the amount of things you have to learn is absolutely overwhelming. The benefit we had early on when we were grant funded is I had lots of time to learn how to do different non-scientific aspects of building and running the company. And we're now in a mode where we're moving too fast. And my ability to spend time on areas that I needed a lot of iteration in order to build my skill sets in that area, it just became untenable because all my time was spent spread everywhere. Again, this is where it's nice having somebody to get to watch those other skill sets and allow myself to learn from somebody in-house. But while I was in that self-learning mode, one of the first opportunities we took advantage of was the FAST program that's offered through California Life Sciences. It was the biggest transition we had towards really understanding how to do science to support a company rather than to have more of an academic flavor to that science. The nice thing about this program is, I was matched with 15 advisors that covered all elements of a company, from preclinical research, clinical research, CMC, regulatory, IP. We had a chief financial officer, a chief business officer on the panel. They really helped me round out a lot of the thinking that moved a little bit away from just R&D group, which is what we were, to a group that was really positioned to have partnering discussions, investment discussions, and get beyond just the preclinical data we were generating and start thinking about, how are we going to make this at scale? How are we going to analyze it? what's our regulatory pathway, all of which I knew were important, but had a very superficial understanding of. But with the FAST program, we were able to take really targeted and deep dives specifically on questions and challenges we had inside the company. We weren't necessarily able to answer all of them, but it put me on a path towards answering them over the next few years. And the group was great because in addition to helping with the company, they were also my start of a network in the industry. So I could go to industry happy hours and they would be there and continue to be there. I still see many of them annually at a happy hour or some industry event. So again, it was just kind of a big transition into the industry for Valitor. And then we were part of the Skydeck cohort when they early on started taking in life science companies. And that was really helpful for me because it was also at that time when I was learning that the story may be more important than the data. I was challenged to create a deck that had no data in it, just as a part of the accelerator program. So that was, I think, really instructive in understanding how to put together a scientific deck that is not necessarily geared towards a scientist, but towards someone who wants to know more about your technology and what you're going to do with it. That was also a real important experience for us.
Speaking of scientific and working with professors, what is it like to have two professors as co-founders? And how do you bring up conversations about equity? I'm just asking about the general advice for people who are going to be working with faculty, because there's always this power dynamic, I believe. I heard it from other people, but I don't know what your experience was. But if there is any advice on that, because you could split the equity 3 ways, but then you got to still build a company.
I'm fortunate in the team that I have, and we've worked together very well for a long time, to the point that one of our investors on our first round, Series A, has a due diligence exercise where he takes the founder and their spouse out for dinner with his wife just to observe the interactions. And I can see that being a highly instructive exercise. We started scheduling that meeting with me and my wife, Kevin and his wife, and Dave and his wife. And then ultimately he came back to me and he said, we don't need to do this. You and Kevin and David have been in a business together for so many years. It can be as challenging as a marriage, and you guys have all made it work. So,
yes.
The other nice thing is, as the company has moved in a direction that is outside of the areas that the technology was being used in their lab, they haven't had a direct line of sight in being able to necessarily answer specific questions about what we're doing now. But it is a huge relief for me that when I do have challenging scientific questions, that I have a direct line into either of them. They answer my phone calls right away, and I'm able to run those questions by them and get really thoughtful answers that help move things forward.
That is great to have that support system. As we are coming to the end of the show, are there topics that I haven't covered about Valitor that I should have talked about, or any lessons that I missed?
The one thing I think I've learned more than anything is this startup process is a game of persistence, and having an understanding that it's uphill all the way. Even when you think you've kind of hit an area that I may be able to coast for a few weeks here, that's when the next thing blows up. And there's never enough people to manage everything that needs to be done. The process of sharing your story is always so mixed with people who are really excited about what you're doing. And as we talked about earlier, all the no's. I think just the persistence that's required can't be underestimated. And I think right alongside that is what makes the persistence worthwhile is that you've got a technology that you're in love with. You've got a clinical problem that you're excited about solving. But more than anything, it's the people that you're doing it with that is the most critical and makes me able to get up on the days that I know I've got challenging meetings and due diligence and a series of pitches or tough technical challenges that we're trying to work through. It's getting to know that I've got a team here that I like working with that I'm going to keep together for as long as possible. So I think ultimately maybe is a cheesy parting note, but under all of this, if you're not having fun every day and you don't have people you're having fun with, then go do something else. This is a hard road to hoe, and find the ways to make it fun.
Thank you for those lessons there. Now to my traditional closing questions. Are there any lessons on mistakes to avoid that other founders could learn from your company?
I think the big one I had early on was, as I mentioned, get out there, tell your story, learn how to tell the story in a way that gets people excited. Don't rely on that perfect data set that's just around the corner that's suddenly going to convince all the investors they want to jump in, because the company and what you have to offer is bigger than your last data set. And really being able to communicate that is really the most important thing.
Are there one or two people that you'd like to acknowledge that played a significant role in building your company?
I mean, I always have to call out Kevin and David. I am still not sure why they allowed me to join the team and help build Valitor, but it's been now my quest of a lifetime, and it's been a hugely rewarding experience. So I can't thank them enough. And then, I think the cohorts of investors that we've brought in through Berkeley Catalyst Fund with Drew Lanza and Ted Howe, Walter Booz at Pandect, Anthony Audi at Morningside, Haitao Zhu at First Spark. And I have them on this thank you list because, as I said, the fact that they invested in us and had a willingness to share our vision and share the journey with us is huge. But they've also become really important team members and really important friends that have provided just an immeasurable amount of advice and other opportunities to meet people and network with people and get integrated into this community in a way that just helps build the network of everyone in the company, as well as putting us on a real solid trajectory for success.
I have to ask this question. This is not traditional, but the supportive role that your spouse played in this journey, especially with twins, I have to acknowledge her.
Yes, she also has a very highly demanding job, and it has been a really amazing to have this opportunity to be able to work together in order for us to both maintain our careers as well as have the two kids. And I think from her employer's perspective as well, there's a life balance that is important to strike in order to make sure they're able to keep their employees. So I think there's a lot of hustle every day in order to get kids out the door and back in the house and fed. But there's also opportunities to unplug and really just enjoy our family and each other. And those opportunities are what get us through the challenging times where logistics are the order of the day.
Thank you, Wes. I learned a lot. I'm sure my audience is going to learn a lot of lessons, especially around that balance in the family act and so many more lessons. Thanks for sharing with me and my audience, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.